Yes, you'll need two things in front of you for this presentation. One is that 6-page executive summary of the 160-page report, and the second is a feedback sheet. So this is, I've been in the classroom for a very long time, and I don't like to spend an hour without having you doing something. So you're going to be giving your opinion after you listen to some of our opinions about your great work. So as we go through these recommendations in the report, you'll be weighing in. And I'll be taking those back from you, so you can just do them anonymously. You do not need to put your name on them. All right, so we're getting set. So I am Judy Mortrude from the Center for Law and Social Policy, which is a small nonprofit based in DC, and my colleague Anna Solinsky is right over there. And I think by now we're fairly familiar faces to many of you. We've been lurking around for a couple of years. We've been really thrilled to have the opportunity to work in partnership with many of you as AB 86 rolled into AB 104. And we've been studying this first year of transition and really offering up our own recommendations. We did this report in June. Some of you may have seen us at the CASP Summer Institute where we did this report, and we've been in town all week meeting with stakeholders at Department of Finance and Senate and Assembly and at the state agencies and with stakeholders like you to talk through these recommendations and see which recommendations we might all have an appetite for moving forward. So the 6-page executive summary is what we're going to go briefly through. And our implementation study is really rooted in the goal of AEBG's purpose. I mean, you more than anyone realize that AEBG was not simply a reinstatement of the state funds. It was really a system redesign about regional coordination to better serve the needs of adult learners. And our implementation study had really 3 purposes. The first was to just foster greater understanding of what was happening in AEBG implementation, and we feel like through our surveys, more than 300 of you answered, and our focus groups and our interviews, we were able to not only study what was happening, but be involved in a kind of active research process with you and continually sort of improving what was happening on the ground with AB 104 rollout. We analyzed current and potential impacts of what was happening for you, what was new for you, what could be new for you, and also what was happening for the students, the participants, through this rollout, through the AB 104. And then finally offering these recommendations for potential policy and implementation changes. And so we have 19 major recommendations that sort into these 4 big buckets. So I'm going to pause at the end of each one of these buckets and have you do a little bit of thinking and weighing in on what you think of these recommendations. So we just get a sense of where there's energy, where there's appetite to move forward. So the 4 big buckets are about, first, just clarifying the mission and vision. Second, driving a comprehensive career pathway system. Vaughn talked about the guided pathway energy that is really moving through the community college now. Where does adult education fit inside the workforce development community college career pathway system? Tying accountability to impact through a cross-system accountability structure. We know there's been a lot of work happening there, and we'll share some of our recommendations. And this comprehensive technical assistance and professional development, which is also a place where a lot of work is moved forward. All right, so in clarifying ABE mission and vision, the 3 primary recommendations, the 3 that we're taking to policymakers, one is really about the community of need, how to connect what you're doing, the impact of your work to the community of need as it's designed in the legislation. The second is about framing up a new ABG accountability system. Again, we know the field team's been out there. There's a new report you'll hear all about if you haven't read that already. Our recommendation also includes the idea of an incentive incentive funding for community of need service, which we'll dig into deeper later this afternoon. And our third bullet is about strengthening the governance of AEBG and really empowering this AEBG virtual office, this sort of third culture between the culture of the adult schools and the culture of the community colleges, to allow the state agencies to create binding guidance for both of those structures under a new governance structure. So I'll go through each of these quickly and then give you a chance to weigh in. So community of need here is, maybe the largest kind of feeling of seismic shift for you in AEBG was about the consortia structure, but I would say maybe the second one is really this idea that the funding is connected to, the formula is derived from these community of need factors. And these are the characteristics that are outlined in the legislation that drive the funding formula. How many households in poverty in your region, the literacy rate of adults, the 7th grade education level in your region, the ELL need in your region. But the real question, we think, is how is AEBG going to show its impact via the community of need formula? We think it's a really solid step. That the WIOA performance metrics are the metrics people talk about in terms of being able to connect your work with the other kinds of funding that are also being invested in adult education through Title II, through Strong Workforce, through your workforce board partners. Having those shared measures will really help the systems that share a low-wage, low-skill population start thinking about leveraging their work together. But we also don't believe that AEBG alone is going to move the needle on these population level characteristics. So we think there's a real need to think about, for stakeholders and state leaders to think about a that collective impact, the collective outcomes of those systems that are all working in this space together. Our report also includes recommendations for the AEBG accountability system, and as we said, the field teams are working here. One of our recommendations is to really identify a model for setting or negotiating targets, much like happens in the Title II money, so that providers have an idea of what performance goals they are shooting for with certain populations, and then having some process to compare the actual outcomes of what happens with those target populations to the goals that you set. Certainly multiple levels of reporting. We know that much of this is underway, but having the kind of reporting that goes to the state level for the legislature, but also consortia level program reporting. I think Vaughn's idea of visualizing this data through Launch Board is one step in that direction. But also member level, consortia member accountability, this member effectiveness language that's in the legislation. How do you gauge sitting around that table together? How do you have that conversation about effectiveness of your consortia partners? And there's language in the law about performance improvement plans. If a member is ineffective, what does that look like? Developing that kind of protocol or process that would be used in that scenario, I think is something that we think the state needs to be involved in. And finally, this incentive for serving community of need. So we heard from many of you as we were doing our research that $500 million is a great investment, but $500 million flat without increasing resources is essentially a cut every year. So people were anxious to think about another way to invest more resources in the program, and our recommendation is really around incentive funding for serving the community of need. And we'll talk about this more later this afternoon. I mean, our hope is incentive funding that's based on performance outcomes, but we don't think we're there in that spot yet to drive that type of system. So this idea that's in the report is about basically earning incentive funding by showing that you're serving more people with more of the need factors that are identified in the community of need. So serving a student with one of those characteristics would be a small bonus, and it would be cumulative the more of those characteristics from community of need in the individual, the more points. This is really based on the kind of outcome-based funding models that we're seeing happen in post-secondary. Ohio is one that is held up as a model, and these sort of modest amounts of money can really drive and incent behaviors in systems. So that's one of the, and I can tell you as we've been having conversations this week with Senate and Assembly staff and others, this is an idea that resonates for policymakers. And then finally, again, this idea of strengthening the governance. So standing up this virtual office, not standing up this office that has these 5 teams was we think, a better idea than standing up yet another silo. But it's really unclear the kind of distribution across the state agency of people on these teams. What is clear is that there's a lot of staff in the Title II world and not as many staff in the larger state investment in adult education, so that disparity is troublesome. We know that the technical assistance providers are taking on some of this work, but technical assistance providers can't create state policy and guidance. So we just think that, again, there's a need for really articulating an ability for the AEBG office to create this kind of guidance, and if that can't happen, then that would be a call for thinking about moving the program, the authority, into one agency. So CLASP obviously has opinions, and we're not shy of saying our opinions, but now it's time to get your opinion. So there is this scale that we're using on your handout. So look for this landscape handout, and I'd like you to weigh in on the three recommendations that I just went over using this scale, 1 through 8. So 1 is, I really like this, I'm going to endorse it. 2 is, I agree with it, but I have a little bit of, contention with it. It's not perfect, it's good enough. 3, I can support it, I can live with it, I have some reservations. 4, I don't care, I'm staying away from this one. 5, I would need to know more. More discussion is needed, I don't understand these issues well enough. 6, I don't like it, but I'll support it. 7, I am serious in disagreement, or 8 is no way. So I'd love you to give a number to each of those 3 recommendations, and also if you have some questions, some comments, something you want to write on there, this is the kind of information that we're going to take moving these recommendations forward. We really need to get the feeling of what you think. So I'll be quiet for a few minutes. All right, I'm going to move us on. So our next bucket of recommendations really fits into this using AEBG to drive a comprehensive career pathway system. And here we have 6 recommendations from guidance on pathway strategies that connect adult schools to community college, to promoting the community college internal alignment efforts for equitable career pathways, and I'll explain each of these with a little bit more detail. Creating guidance on ability to benefit pathways. Ability to benefit is a mechanism to allow people without a high school credential to start using federal financial aid to pay for their post-secondary education. 4th is designing career pathways with your WIOA core partners, so Title I, adult, youth, Title IV, rehabilitation services. 5th is strengthening the priority of service link among AEBG and WIOA and human services. And then 6 is immigrant integration pathways. So again, I'll just give you a really brief synopsis of each of these and then ask you to weigh in. So obviously transition is a big part of the AEBG mission, and we have a series of recommendations about creating more guidance, more directives from the state agencies about dual enrollment for adults, basically taking down the barriers. When I was talking about this at the CWA conference not that long ago, somebody stood up and said, well, we tried that and it didn't work. And I said, well, the students didn't progress. No, it wasn't anything about the students. It was something about fees and the college. And I was like, well, yes, that doesn't mean it didn't work. It just means it's hard. So, like, what can we do to make it easier to really build dual enrollment for adults? Credit for prior learning agreements, adult school CTE to community college programs of study. How can we make sure that if somebody earns a credential without credits, that it actually does build into the next part of the pathway? We had a very technical fix about, and I think this one's already underway, about listing all adult schools on the community college district online application system, so you could actually see in the data where transition was happening between adult schools and the community colleges. And then linking the guided pathways conversation to adult schools. You know, it's guided pathways is an excellent intra-institutional, is how I like to think about it, something that happens inside a community college to really take that cafeteria model of course taking and put it into more of a, what do they call those, like tasting menu where you go and it's arranged for you. So that's one part of the guided pathways initiative, but where are the low skill adults in that initiative? Where are the on-ramps for people who might be in basic skills or non-credit courses? So beyond the guided pathways, there are other big investments and big redesign efforts that are happening internally in the community college system that have such great potential to align with adult basic education. Obviously, the Basic Skills and Student Outcomes Transformation Program, the Student Success and Support Program, the Student Equity Plans, these are all places where maybe right now people are only thinking about AA-enrolled students in those programs, but the mission and vision of those programs really can align with the adult education program. The credit versus non-credit, this has been an interesting conversation that we've had with policymakers in the last couple of days. You know, the apportionment, equal credit versus non-credit, and what that impact is for equity for students. We just think there needs to be a lot of looking at the patterns that start occurring, what kinds of students are offered the non-credit pathways, what kind of students are offered the credit pathways. Are we putting more roadblocks up for low skill students who have foundational skill needs beyond just occupational skill needs? So that's a big part of that conversation. And then developmental education, we've heard about, what is it, SB 750, the bill that's currently underway, thinking about DevEd redesign in your system. In a lot of ways, we feel like adult education block grant has been asked to address the developmental education controversy in the community college system, but it alone can't do that. So, but real strategic thinking about how the developmental education question and the adult education block grant system work together. Ability to benefit. So this is again this mechanism to allow students, and we know in the community college system, many low-income students can get a BOG waiver. They can get their tuition waived, but for many adults, that's not the only barrier, right? There are living expenses. There are opportunity costs to working less and going to school more. So being able to combine the federal financial aid of a Pell Grant to a BOG waiver will allow much greater access for a low-wage adult. So the state could have a number of ways to incentivize this. This can happen now. This can happen locally at any institution. But how does the state get involved to help incent this behavior, give comfort to colleges that start releasing financial aid, federal financial aid to students without high school diplomas? Because when this came back, ability to benefit was around for quite a while. It went away because of concerns about for-profit use of this mechanism. It came back with the career pathway program definition as part of it. So students have to be eligibilized in one of the three ways, but then they also must be enrolled in a career pathway program. And the career pathway program definition is exactly the same definition in the Higher Education Act, is exactly the same definition as in the WIOA, the WIOA, Title I, Title II, Title IV, Title III Act. So it's another great opportunity to both get the check the box for local workforce boards that have the mandate to convene their education partners to design and implement these types of programs, and to turn on that ability to benefit mechanism to start allowing students to get the federal financial aid to support them in these programs. And whenever I show this little snip out of the legislation, which I keep covered in tape and put on my bulletin board because I'm so proud of it, and you should be too, because it is the work that you all were doing on the ground that got codified when this legislation passed. I always highlight D&E when I'm talking to educators, because D&E is the magic of what you're asked to do in this system, right? This is a career pathway program is this combination of high quality education training and other services. But D&E is really the integrated education and training component, the idea of contextualizing and offering concurrently workforce preparation, workforce training, workforce preparation, largely those 21st century skills that Bon talked about, adult ed, and workforce training, which can be offered in a million different ways. Well, not a million, but many, including on-the-job training, including pre-apprenticeship, including CTE courses. So offering this kind of this kind of instructional service delivery model is really the power and the change that's being asked of you in a career pathway program model. So we think there's a lot that the state could do to drive this kind of service model. Next, for the comprehensive career pathway system is talking about WIOA priority of service. So this is a mandate inside the Title I, your workforce development adult, Title I adult program has a priority for serving low-income, public benefit recipient, basic skill deficient adults. Well, basic skill deficient is someone unable to compute or solve problems, read, write, or speak English at a level necessary to function on the job, in the family, in society. Obviously, a huge overlap between the people you serve and the priority of service for that WIOA Title I. So we really think this is an opportunity for joint guidance to come out between the labor agency and EDD and your programs. And last one here, immigrant integration. We know this is a cabinet level position now with your governor, and there's a directive in AEBG that your senior leadership really seeks advice from, coordinates with other state officials. We know that the regional plans, the 14 WIOA regional plans in California, if there was at least a 15% ELL population in that region, they were required to include demographic information about that population and strategies to serve that population. We know that there's currently 5 places in the state that are doing these Workforce Navigator pilot programs, so there's going to be a lot of information to come out about that. And we also know that IET is a very powerful strategy for incumbent worker, non-native English speakers. So again, another opportunity, we think, for guidance and support to your field on how to align with those other services. Okay, I'll be quiet and ask you to vote. Okay, looks like I can move forward. Diane also wanted me to let you know that this presentation will be sent out to you all, so you will have a copy of this. All right, third bucket. The third bucket is about establishing this cross-system accountability structure to impact the community of need, and we have 6 major recommendations here. The first is about distinguishing population from program. As you well know, you went from, in the legacy system of adult education, 10 program areas, then in AB 86, I think it was 5, and then when it finally came out in AB 104, you had 7, right? But those program areas are sort of a mix of population characteristics and program characteristics. Clarify the fund reporting on the objectives, the 5 major objectives in AB 104. Aligning the data definitions and processes between ABG and Title II and the community college providers. Maximizing the measurable skill gain metric that's allowable to you and to your Title I partners under WIOA. Clarifying transition to post-secondary across reporting for the 3 ABG Title II and in the launch board. And measuring progress on those 5 mandated objectives in your regional plans. So I'll go through each one of those, and again, ask you to weigh in. So this should look familiar to you, right? This population of program areas, and our recommendation is very specific about using data flags to really differentiate between the program areas, like having a program that is a CTE program or an ELL program, and populations like individuals with disabilities or incumbent workers, or actually tying this to the populations that are identified in WIOA Title II, and that you probably are, if you're using TOPS for Enterprise, you're familiar with, the individuals with barriers to employment categorization that came to us in WIOA. Much expanded, including things like homeless and single parenting and basic skills deficient and low income. Similarly, the fund reporting that happens under the objectives, currently the AEBG funds are reported via both that program, the 7 programs, but also through the objectives. And we think that that these objectives, the seamless transition, the gaps in service, the accelerate progress, either need some renaming or some further characterization. Notably, gaps in service, that's where most people spent their money in the early days, and that's exactly what you would expect with a reinvestment, right? That there would be new classes being stood up, but either there should be quite a drop in that as we move forward because it's not new service, it's sustained service, or maybe that needs to be renamed to sustainability of service provision or something like that. Similarly, we think accelerate progress needs to be further defined if these are integrated education and training strategies, if they are really strategies meant to accelerate progress, and accelerate is one of those words that is also in that career pathway definition and causes a lot of confusion between educators and their workforce partners. We think there's more guidance here that makes it clear that accelerate is about integrating. It's about contextualizing, it's about concurrent service delivery, it's not about compressed time, it's not about asking people to do things, take a 12-week course, offer it in 6, and make it work for a low-skill adult. So we think those are kinds of distinctions that need to be made in those AEBG objectives. The definitions, there are a number of definitions, and we know the field team, the AEBG field team is doing a lot of work in aligning data definitions and types, but we also think that attention needs to be paid to aligning AEBG to Title II. For example, in transition, the transition definition, we really applaud your definition the field team came up with of transition to post-secondary, meaning transition to credit-based post-secondary work. But WIOA allows, across all the titles, transition to developmental education as a transition performance outcome. So, that kind of data collection will have to be done in a way that allows the reporting as the feds define it and the reporting the way you will define it here in California, so that you don't completely confuse people out in the field on how to collect and define that transition strategy. We also think the transition strategy that's embedded inside AEBG and acknowledging transition from different levels inside the adult education spectrum is super important. Doesn't connect directly to the way Title II thinks about transition, but very valuable. So having these distinctions made is just really an important part. Similarly, Title II is going to have to report, do WIOA quarterly reporting and stand up a wage record match protocol so that when you don't have a social security number for someone, there's another supplemental wage protocol, a way to see that. Having that similar sort of a protocol inside AEBG would certainly help with alignment. So those are the kind of suggestions we're making about certain definitions. You probably can't see this in the back, but here is our measurable skill gain slide. ABG is using WIOA measures. We know that. There's some confusion across the whole country with WIOA measures, and especially with this one. And as we heard in a stakeholder group, a workforce stakeholder group earlier this week, we're using WIOA measures, and when we asked about measurable skill gain, they said, well, not that one. Well, that's the one. That's the one that will allow service to low-skill, low-wage adults who will take interim progress measures. It's the measure that Title II has lived and died on for the last 15 years, right? If we didn't have a way to show we were making incremental progress with people over multiple program years sometimes, we would have not been able to serve the populations we cared most about. So measurable skill gain under WIOA has confusion happening federally between the titles. Some states are, even in their Title II system, in their adult education system, are using the full complement, even if they're not all on the national reporting system yet, because, again, WIOA Title II will have to do quarterly reporting separate from the NRS, separate from the national reporting system of this full complement of measurable skill gains, and we think adult education block grant should be, basically we just think your adult education block grant and Title II should be operating as one program. So anything you're doing on one side, you should be doing on the other. And educational function level gain is the one, if you're a Title II provider, you're most familiar with. Most people think of that as pre-test, post-test, but there are other ways, including that's where the transition definition is now. That's where high school diploma is. It's also listed there on the second line. Accumulating credits, secondary or post-secondary credits. So again, interim progress measures, if you're doing an integrated education and training with a credit-based CTE course, for example. Training milestone, we think, is a super powerful strategy, super powerful metric if you're doing incumbent worker training and you are working with an employer, maybe a pre-apprenticeship, maybe an on-the-job training. You're working with a employment training panel type program. You and the employer decide on what the milestones are in the training, and if you can document them, then that's a measurable skill gain. And skills progression is about passing knowledge-based exams. So a lot of the exams that are part of occupational training industry recognized credentials that are gained through knowledge-based exams would be part of the skills progression metrics. So, so there are actual different ways besides the way that our systems have been set up for a long time on pre-test, post-test to show these kinds of skill gains. And we think, again, that having joint guidance, not only between ABG and Title II, but between Title II and Title I, will help drive a lot more co-enrollment between the titles. Measuring progress on objectives. So again, these are the ABG objectives. Right now, there hasn't been, there's been planning, right? You have to put these in your planning documents, but having some sort of, we feel like once the data and accountability sort of gets more automatic as is happening through the systems, that then it could be an opportunity to take time to do more sort of reflective progress measurement on the objectives. So thinking this is a chart that we put in the report, but I think it needs, it'll need tweaking. But this, what strategies did you use, for example, in seamless transition? What challenges prevented you from getting fully to implementation? What kind of intervention strategies are you going to try next? What could the state do to be supportive? So gathering this kind of information about the specific strategies that are happening out there in the field, I think is important both to the technical assistance providers and as a story, as a narrative to tell about the power of your programs. I would also say that whatever happens with these, they should really be doable by the consortia members, right? And not take consultants to do them, because it really should be the voice of your consortia practitioners. Okay, that's the end of that. More opportunity for you to weigh in. Our last set of recommendations is around really building this community of practice, this comprehensive technical assistance, this professional development. Again, this is this is an area where we think you've really started. I mean, the fact that we're all sitting in this room together today, right? The bringing together the leadership shows that there's been some real attention to this area. So I'll go through these and see what other things I can add to that progress that's already being made. We do think that this kind of change, systems change, really needs attention to change management, leadership across all levels, and especially senior leadership, building capacity on how to manage change of this scale. So I'll talk about that a little bit. Talk about establishing these common standards across providers. That's language that's in the legislation, and I know there's been some efforts there. We have some recommendations. Supporting and strengthening the consortia structure itself. Really the hallmark of AEBG is this consortia structure. It's unprecedented around the country, and we think it's we know it is a difficult piece of work, but we think it's a super vital piece of work, and more attention should be paid to strengthening that. And then incentivizing things that we learned from watching what you all are doing in the field, and really these faculty-led models of learning communities, especially across the two big agencies. So the leadership at all levels, just basically saying, the inclusion of AEBG in strategic planning structures, in strong workforce, in WIOA, really demonstrates the importance that senior leadership has put on the AEBG effort, and stretches local leaders to really see their efforts, your efforts, within this larger context of economic mobility for individuals and regional economic competitiveness. And our study really revealed the need for training to help build the skills of local leaders to collaborate across agencies, to understand where the win-win is, to really be able to articulate the opportunities and the barriers in those kinds of collaborations for system leaders, and really to support these kind of cross-agency policies, get them developed and sustained. The former chancellor, when we were here last with you all, stood up and talked about collaboration as something that we can't just ask other people to do, and we think there are some real opportunities for capacity building in that area. For instructor standards, we know yesterday there was a meeting at the LAO, right, where they talked about this. We met with some Senate and Assembly staff after who had been at that meeting. We weren't there. Who said, well, I don't know, is there a problem? We're not sure there's really a problem. So that was an interesting reaction to that hearing. We certainly know that there is instruction in the legislation to pay attention to the qualifications of instructors, including having some common standards across entities. This doesn't mean, this isn't saying, right, that everyone has to have exactly the same standards, but there should be some common standards. So we think there's an opportunity here, perhaps for the TAPS to stand up a field team of practitioners to come to some agreement on what are the essential qualifications to be an adult educator, whether you are working with a teaching license, whether you are working without a teaching license in a college system, but what are sort of the agreed upon essential qualifications to be an adult education professional. Consortia structure, again, as you well know, it requires this collaboration with adult schools and community colleges, but there's so much more beyond that. When you look at your regional fact sheets, right, or you look inside the legislation and see how you are asked in your region to be coordinating beyond the adult school and community college system, but also to be coordinating with with the correctional education providers, with the CalWorks money, with the apportionment money that's coming in through the community college system. So having a deep understanding of those systems and how they could be leveraged together, really building the capacity of local consortia leaders to understand those other adult-serving systems in their region, and really developing that vision outside of this one funding stream. And building the targeted capacity with understanding credit-based and the non-credit-based, credit-based developmental education, and the community colleges, non-credit and credit, and why those two things exist and who they are meant to serve and how they leverage with AABG. Really understanding the Title II Adult Education and Family Literacy Act providers, understanding the basic skills and non-credit CTE providers and how they align with these systems. So again, we think there's more to be done on building that larger change management system in your region. And again, the last one, the professional learning community, obviously a very strong model of building capacity for direct service providers, for your instructors. And we know some of these models are being stood up, and we really think that the AABG office, the TAPS, should be providing that guidance, that ongoing support for the kind of inter-institutional, between your institution, professional learning communities, to really help embed collaboration. And you know, that takes some not only capacity building, it probably takes some policy change to make time in people's days, in your instructors' days, to be able to do this kind of peer-to-peer, cross-agency collaboration to make those kinds of transition strategies real. So those three are really the end of it, and I'll ask you to finish filling out your... All right, to wrap up, I just want to say that Anna and I have felt really honored to be part of this ongoing conversation with you. We're going to be sticking around a little while longer to help see you into the next 3-year planning cycle and keep having these conversations with stakeholders. I want to acknowledge the Neil Kelly. He's always the worst. I want to acknowledge the importance of the work you do and the choices that your students make. I'm calling you out. And with putting this quote up, this was a quote that came out of your legislature on the day after the election last year, so just to get a little bit political. Regardless of your politics, you've got to admit that California is a huge force in what happens nationally, in what happens in economies, what happens in our ecology, and certainly what happens in our education system. And we really think AABG is setting the tone for the continued innovation in adult education. So we thank you for your work, and you always know where to find us. If there were things you wanted to share today that you didn't share on the sheet, you can always find us here. So thank you.